All right, many of the viewers requested that we get Jon on, and Jon's book is My Search for Madeleine, one reporter's 14-year hunt to solve Europe's most harrowing crime. Jon is spelled Jon, and it's Clarke, Clarke. All of Jon's links are in the description box below this video if you want to follow up and get his book. And we've never had Jon on the channel before, so this is going to be a unique opportunity to get another side to this story that just never leaves the news headlines. So Jon, huge thank you for coming on. And firstly, what got you interested in the McCann case?
Well, I can tell you it's actually 16 years now. It was 14, that's 16, or going into 16 years. And what got me interested in the case was just literally a very early morning phone call told from a foreign desk flunky to just get my arse down to Portugal as quickly as possible and cover a story that seemed pretty low key and pretty minor, but to him it seemed quite important. I think by nature of the fact it could have been a doctor and she could have been blonde and had blue eyes. So that was me, slightly cynical, slightly early in the morning, slightly tired, getting in the car and driving all the way from where I lived at the time in Ronda all the way to southern Portugal, to Pradaluz for my first visit there. And so that's what got me interested. And from that day, I've kind of always covered the case and always.
When did you notice that this was not a run-of-the-mill disappearance case?
Well, probably, that's a good question. Probably around halfway through that day, I'd say, it began to become a bit like, oh, she's not going to turn up. She's not going to just sort of wander back. We haven't found her body, and I've been like all around that bloody area, all around Pradaluz, you know, every single back street off into the country, and talked to everyone I could. And I think probably by mid-afternoon, late afternoon, I thought, no, this is likely to have been a snatch. And you know, by the time of the press conference that evening, when they famously came out of the apartment and gave their press conference at the steps of the Ocean Club, you could sense their despair. It was exactly 24 hours later. And I don't know if it was timed almost to the moment that Maddie had got missing. It was around 9:15, 9:30 that night. And it must have been almost exactly that time that Maddie had been taken. And they were just distraught. They were, you know, you could sense it. It was just, you know, the atmosphere you cut with a knife. And it's not, at that point, there's not much you can do. It was on the news, it was on the national news. So there wasn't that much for me to do apart from just to sort of take some pics and listen in and try and get a few pointers. And, you know, I wasn't a crime journalist. I was just a general news journalist, but I had done a lot of crime reporting back in London and in Spain, of course, a lot of crime down here. And so I just sort of stuck around for a few days then and did my best to try and understand as best as possible what had happened. And it was just, you know, I then went back for my daughter's birthday, which was quite moving. She was very young at the time, and then came back out again a couple of days later, well, in fact the day after, and then was there for another week more or less, and backwards and forwards really for the first month or two. So yeah, I did lots of reporting on it live in the resort, and got to know all the journalists from the very beginning who were covering it. A lot who at the time knew the case much better than me because they were living and breathing it 24/7. But because I'm more of a sort of Sunday news reporter, more, you know, I guess you'd probably say I like following a more exclusive beat, separate beat. I could go off on angles and leads that maybe perhaps the other guys weren't going on because they had to just sort of follow the other sort of daily news agenda. So someone at the Telegraph would have to make sure they followed someone at the Mail, had to follow someone at the Sun. I could be, because I was working for the Mail on Sunday, the Sunday Mirror, I was able to sort of go off a little bit off diary and start digging into stuff that perhaps they didn't. And of course, a lot of them were sent home and then brought other journalists out. So they lost that continuity. But because I've always been in Spain, and because there were so many links to Spain, and it's probably highly likely that Madeleine did come across the border at some point. And because, you know, there's so many stories broke in Spain afterwards, I covered most of those, and we broke a load of our own stories as well, so-called sightings and claims of this and that. So I kept a really close interest in it over the years. And, you know, I always thought I should probably write a book on it, and never did. Wrote another crime book that sold pretty well right at the beginning, and then did a restaurant book, slightly different. And then when suddenly out of the blue, you know, they announced that they had a German suspect a couple of years ago, I got straight on that. I just got onto the Mail on Sunday news desk and just said, look, you know, do you want me on this? And it was in the lockdown, and so they were just delighted I could get straight over there and before anyone else and really, you know, muscle in on it. And that point, I thought that, you know, this is perhaps the time I should write a book on it. And so I just sort of immersed myself for a year and a half, really just pulling it all together. And I've, you know, I'm going to do a second edition of it fairly soon. There's going to be another edition, and it'll be up, and it'll be very different to the first. It's going to be a lot of new stuff. The case, as you probably know, keeps moving and changing, and you know, I know you've covered it a fair bit. I've seen your name. I've tried to contact you, Sean, a couple of times. I think we've got mixed up through Donald, a mutual friend, Donald McIntyre. And I know you've been talking to people on the case quite a lot, haven't you? You know, so, you know, it's, and, you know, someone gave me a blank check. I could probably go to 10 different doorsteps, 10 different areas tomorrow over the next month and carry on digging. But unfortunately, I haven't got the deepest pockets. I can't keep. So I have to sort of wait for the right moment to kind of go off and do my reporting and do my digging. But I think we're getting close. I think we're getting close to solving the case.
All right, well, let's go over this much more slowly then. So on the day in question, would you say there was hope early on and the atmosphere changed?
I'd say there was hope initially, yeah. I certainly hoped, certainly. But yeah, I think it became quite apparent early on that you know, that she had been taken. But I think what was interesting was the press conference we had in Portimao a few days later, where the chief of police said, "Oh, look, we know who's taken her," because then they were saying, "Well, it was a kidnapping. We know who's taken her, and she's within," he said, to quote, 3 kilometers, or was it 3 miles of Pradalou. So we thought, I mean, what's that all about? How do they know this? And so there was a sort of hope that perhaps she was alive, and that you know, we were going to get back. So there was some hope amid the gloom.
Did you ever find out the basis for them saying that?
No, never found out. And I don't know, but as you well know, Sean, there's a couple of interesting policemen who are linked to this case, fairly senior policemen, one who became one of the most senior, I would say, establishment figures in Portugal, certainly the top 100 key figures in Portugal, who's currently in prison and will be in prison for 7 to 8 years.
Who's that?
A guy called Cristoval Pereira. He was the deputy of Gonçalo Amaral in the Algarve, and he worked on other missing children's cases, and has spoken a lot about Madeleine McCann, has written a book on Madeleine McCann, and became the president of the Missing Persons Bureau in Portugal, the Missing Children's Bureau, no less, not even Missing Persons, Missing Children's Bureau in Portugal, then became the president of Sporting Lisbon, and then got accused then of corruption while at Sporting Lisbon, and then got found guilty of running a crime gang that kidnapped families and children in Lisbon and in Sintra, and is found guilty of running this gang and is now in prison for it, thankfully. I know
he was in charge of investigating these matters that he was committing.
The police over there did, and I can tell you that what's particularly interesting is his connections to sort of the Knights Templar and Opus Dei and shady,
oh my goodness, please tell us all about that. I'm getting goosebumps.
Well, you can write it. There's a bit in my first book. There'll be a lot more in the second book, but I have to be very careful when I go across the border, because I don't want to get picked up as I go into Portugal. So I don't know if any of them are going to watch this podcast, but you know, I think, am I right in saying you've been down to Orchiva even at one point? Have you been down to the Alpujarras in Granada, or do you talk to people, didn't you, on your show who were in the Alpujarras?
So we've interviewed Mark Williams Thomas, who was out there quite fast. We've interviewed John Wedge at ex-London Met Cop. We've interviewed David Icke. We've interviewed Sonia Poulton. So we've had a range of viewpoints, from abduction to some kind of abuse ring,
Yeah,
to
the
the
abuse ring
parents.
was interesting. That's I wanted to ask you about that. How do you see that as credible? Did you not find a woman who was based out of Auckland claimed she was trafficked at one point? Am I right in saying?
Um,
Talk to someone.
we've had every claim under the sun. The people we've interviewed have claimed everything under the sun regarding McCann. The bottom line is, it's one of those things that nobody's ever going to know unless it is solved, as you said earlier. But that's what drives perpetual interest, isn't it? It's like, who killed Epstein, who killed JFK. These things, the public never lose interest in them because they've not been solved.
I think we are 90% or 95% to solving it. I think when the German police say we are confident that we know what happened to Maddie and that she's dead, and that the family pretty much accept that now, that I think, as I understand it, that the evidence is there. It's not the best clear-cut evidence, but it's good evidence. And there's certain bits that I can't, unfortunately, tell you about because I'm sworn secrecy, that I do know about, that are so good that, unfortunately for Mr. Brueckner, he's not going to get off. He will go to court and he will be found guilty of at least, at the very least, abduction.
Well, what was the role of Opus D in this? And can you explain what they are?
Well, I mean, it's more Knights Templars and Opus Dei, which is a far kind of quite shady Catholic organisation linked to the Catholic Church. And the Knights Templar were famously come out of the Crusades, when Christian crusaders came down to, fundamentally, people think they all went to Jerusalem, to fight in Jerusalem during the Crusades. But actually, the Crusades were very much linked as well to Spain and Portugal, because from 711 up to 1492, Spain and Portugal and bits of France were ruled by the Moors, the Moorish kingdoms. So it was traditionally kind of important that Catholics, Protestants, Knights came down to fight the Arabs in Spain. And so these organizations are celebrated. And I can tell you now that some of the key police figures and establishment figures in Portugal are members of these slightly shady groups. And as you probably know, Portugal has a very bad track record for networks and rings. And, at the time of Maddie going missing, there was an extremely serious investigation that had been first seen the light of day 30 years earlier, then been pushed down, and it came up again 20 years earlier and been squashed again. And finally, it'd been brought forward thanks to the amazing work of one of those abused, who became a lawyer, who was just so bloody minded and insisted it had to come out. And that case, believe it or not, at the time of Madeleine going missing, you could still sit in a cafe in Lisbon with your laptop open and look at pornography legally. But in 2008 and 2009, finally came to court, and various senior establishment figures, well over 30, were found guilty, although only, I think, 12 or 13 went to prison. But that included lawyers, TV personalities, doctors, a huge retinue of very senior establishment figures in Portugal. There was even claims that the Prime Minister at the time was linked to it, even one of the opposition leaders, lots of stuff in the press of the countersuing. So this problem existed. And it's fair to say, would you not agree, that if the lawyers and the medical profession and the judiciary are involved, it's probably likely that the police force is also involved in some way. Some members of them are involved. I think it'd be naive to say, oh no, the police have in the police force. That'd be very naive. I'm not blaming. I'm not pointing a finger at anyone here, Sean. But there've been some cover-ups, and there's been a lot of conjecture about exactly how closely some of the police were involved in this case, how much covering up went on, and some of the linked cases, such as the current case of Hazel Bean, as she usually say it in Irish, Behan, you may know it there, but Hazel Bean, who was...
I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I've got some exciting news to announce. Michael Franzese is coming back to tour the UK in 2024. The Remade Man Tour, the Michael Franzese story. Michael Franzese, once named one of the 50 most significant mob bosses in the USA by Fortune magazine, and a former member of the notorious Colombo crime family, will take you deep into the world of organized crime, sharing captivating tales and insights into the mafia's past, present, and future. Join us for an unforgettable evening with Michael Franzese, the original Goodfella, as he exclusively sits down with myself, Sean Atwood. With me as the host, there's going to be a no-holes-barred exploration of Michael Franzese's life, including his numerous arrests and jury trials that ultimately led to his pleading guilty to a federal racketeering charge, a 10-year prison sentence, and $15 million in restitution. You will have the unique opportunity to ask questions during an audience Q&A session, making this event a must-see for true crime enthusiasts and anyone curious about the underworld. Don't miss this explosive in-conversation with Michael Franzese. Live on stage in the UK, this exclusive in-person event will be held in various locations in the UK, Ireland and Scotland. Link in the description box below this video if you want to grab yourself a ticket. Back to the podcast. Cheers.
Very savagely by a man on camera in and around Pradelouche, very close to Pradelouche in Portimao, and she was treated appallingly and slut shamed, and you know, the police actually knew. They said to her, "We know who did this," but they didn't help her get the case out. They just ignored her. They treated her like dirt. And other cases, there are other 5 cases that are due up at some point. We'd hoped it would have been this spring. Looks like it's going to be the autumn now. One of those other cases was a child on a beach who was abused by a man who looked strikingly like Christian Brueckner, who the family say is Christian Brueckner. And they obviously want to get justice there. Of course, there's the 4 children in the park that were exposed to Christian Brueckner at near midnight. Can you imagine the scare of your child being under in a play park, very dark, near midnight, and a man takes his dick out and whatever? And so they want justice, of course. So eventually we'll hopefully see it, but right the way through, it's been slowed down and slowed down and slowed down, and it's a painstaking process. And I'm very pleased to say that, you know, I've got very good access to the police and the judiciary and a lot of the key characters that are in this, and a lot of it's just a sort of slow burn of telling their stories and bringing them together and speaking to them and updating them, and them updating me, and sort of, you know, trying to go forwards as best as possible. But I am confident, despite what you may read in the Sun or the Mail or in fact all the papers recently, that the case is now being dropped and that, you know, he could be out any minute soon. I'm pretty confident that's not the case.
All right, John, going back to the first few days again then. So the McCanns were criticised for their behaviour in the aftermath. Do you think that criticism is valid, or do you think they were in shock and people behave differently in shock, so there's no real yardstick there as to how to judge people?
They were criticised in lots of ways. In which particular way are you referring to?
Well, they were criticised for not showing enough emotion, for going out jogging and not, you know, joining the search and things like this. Various criticisms have come to light.
I think it's fair to say, Sean, that everyone acts differently, and you've got a medical couple, one a fairly senior career doctor, one a GP, and who see and live and breathe death on a daily basis, have to stay strong for their patients, have to handle grief and emotion, that it would be fairly normal for them to want to hold it together and to look perhaps I'm sure they looked emotional enough to me when I saw that press conference. They certainly showed a lot of emotion. But yeah, I think why would you need someone to break down on TV to think that they actually showed emotion? I think the criticism was unfair. Yeah, there's some conjecture about leaving your kids in a room and supposedly going backwards and forwards, but equally all their friends should also be criticised. And a lot of people did it back then. They don't so much now, do they? And there were some mistakes made. They'd be the first to admit it. And no, I think it's difficult to criticise them. I think that's a side issue, really.
So in these cases, then the parents are often on the suspect list. What happened with the Portuguese police and the parents?
Yeah, well, I think they were desperate to find some clues and to actually move forwards. And I think, obviously, logically, everyone would always look at the family in a case like this. It's the most obvious thing you would do. And probably 75% of the time you'd be right, and you would actually find, the perpetrator amongst the family or close friends. But it's understandable they would bring the family in for questioning, and they would pick apart their timelines. And I just think they were naive to think that there was a group of professional doctors that could have been so deceptive and could have been so, I don't know if there was evil, but certainly completely criminal in plotting to protect their friends, if you like. I think that, to me, it seemed fairly obvious, and I think it's obvious to the British government and certainly Operation Grange that they weren't involved, they weren't guilty from the beginning. So I think that what it lost 2 to 3 months of valuable time when they could have been looking for key clues. So I think it actually scuppered the whole investigation by getting very fixated on the McCanns.
What about the allegation that Madeleine was drugged, the cowpoll and all that stuff?
They deny it. They said they had used drugs. They said they had them, but they said they hadn't given it to him. And there's no evidence, is there? So, let's just accept it, that they didn't drug her.
Why would they have those drugs with them then?
I think everyone used Calpol and things like that, didn't they? Back in the day, I think they still do, to help the kids sleep. Especially if you're a doctor, I think it wouldn't be out of the norm to have certain sleeping drugs or pills. I think it's always a bit of interest in the fact that the two twins, now 18, aren't they? They slept right the way through, apparently, which is amazing. But having had kids of my own, it's amazing, how they can sleep through these sort of things. And once they're asleep, they really are asleep. I'm not a doctor, and I'm not, so I couldn't really comment on that.
All right, so you took us through day one then. What happened on day two?
Gosh, it's 15 years ago, 16 years ago, Sean. I think I continued to dig on what had sort of going on. I think by end of day two, I think we were starting to be a little bit suspicious of one of the locals, Mr. Murat, who I think he's been exonerated, but I still think he was very suspicious at the time.
What was the suspicion based on?
I think based on his sudden, very deep interest in the case, and the fact that he was very closely linked to the police operation. He was translating a lot for the police. He was bringing a lot of local characters in. He showed a lot of enthusiasm and excitement for the case. Plus, he also coincidentally lived so close and had line of sight of the actual apartment. So I think it would be logical in the way that the police would look at the family. The journalists there would start looking at other people around them as well. So, if you like, that's our job, really, isn't it? As journalists, is to look at all the possibilities and eventualities, which is what I was doing. As you may know, the Sunday Mirror actually did call up the British police in Leicestershire and did report him to the police, who then reported it to the Portuguese police, who then did eventually see fit to arrest Robert Murat. And actually, we didn't run the story first because it was on Sky News and the dailies first. But I think that's, if you like, I think that was fairly responsible reporting, because we were reporting on what we thought was a possibility or a good possibility. What else? I think we also pretty quickly discovered this huge number